welcome everybody. Very happy to see you guys here and online as well. Today we have Tobias Stark here from Utrecht University, European Center on Migration and Ethnic Relations. And I think his connection with Deep today is in the framework of this RPA on polarization, segregation and inequality, which we're starting quite soon. And we're very excited to hear him speak about how dual identifiers affect interethnic relations in social networks. So please.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, and thank you for being here. As I learned, you're used to asking questions between. That's completely fine with me. I'll now try to be mindful of the time nonetheless. So what I'm sharing today is a research from my ERC project that I'm leading. And we started a year and a half ago, so we're still at the beginning, but we have made progress, and I'm very happy to share that and get your insights and your ideas also, because there's a lot more we want to do. So, okay, where do we start? Where do I start? So what we've seen in, or I should stand here for the camera, sorry. What we've seen in the past decades is increasing ethnic diversity in a lot of European countries. And at the same time, we've also seen a lot of these examples that prejudice towards immigrants or minority groups in general are rising. And there's also a lot of evidence for ethnic minority groups that are experiencing discrimination and exclusion. And because of that, also developing negative beliefs towards the majority group. We've seen a glimpse of that in a lot of examples by 2020, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests worldwide. So what I've proposed in DRC and what we are trying to explore is basically that there's a largely overlooked group that may help us improve intergroup relations. And to explain this a little bit more, I want to take you back to the World Football Champion World Cup 2018 was, right? But if you might remember that Switzerland at that time played fairly well, at least in the first couple of rounds. And so they were really good at scoring goals. And there were a couple of Swiss players who always made this double-headed eagle gesture after they scored a goal. And that is the national symbol of Albania. They did this to show their dual belonging to both Switzerland and also Kosovo, Albania. And it was quite interesting what happened there was this realization that these players were not just Swiss, but also had another identity that led to what's been called a massive perspective-taking exercise in the Swiss public, trying to understand what it really means to belong to multiple groups. And coincidentally, colleagues from Bern were conducting a correspondence study on discrimination on the housing market in Switzerland, and one of their target group were Kosovo Albanians, and so they tracked how much discrimination or how hard it was for Kosovo Albanians to get a house, an apartment in Switzerland at that time. And they saw basically discrimination up until the World Cup started, and then it completely disappears for a month after that. And that's an illustration of the theory that we're trying to explore, that potentially this realization that someone is a dual identifier, your in-group, your own group, and an out-group, can reduce prejudice and improve intergroup relations. So this leads then also to the first research aim that we have, and that's really trying to understand what is the effect? Is there this effect that we've seen in this one instance with the soccer world championship? Basically, can we see that realizing or striving to belonging to other people or to immigrants improves intergroup relations? Now, what makes dual identifiers so unique, and that is why I'm particularly interested in, because I have a background in social networks, and I'm trying to illustrate this here. So if you assume that this is a social network of, for example, friendship relations in a school class or so, and then you have the majority group, in this case, Switzerland, so these are all ethnic Swiss people, and you have the immigrant group, they identify Albanians, and then you have these dual identifiers. And what makes them unique is that both this group and also this group can consider this person as an in-group member. They can see them as a member of their own group. And we know from a lot of studies, decades of research, the homophily principle, for example, that people prefer to socialize with others that they're similar to them. And so that might put this person in a better position to create friendship ties both with this group, and then subsequently integrate this social network. So processes like a friend of friend is a friend, and so on. And that's why we believe that dual identifiers may have the potential to improve intergroup relations. Now, we are not the first to look into this. There's one other group around Aaron Levy. He got a PhD in Groningen. He's now at Columbia, I think. And he introduced this term of gateway group research, where also his argument is also very similar. I think that the realization that someone is both an in-group member and an out-group member might improve the attitudes towards the out-group. And that's the kind of paradigm that he has been using, looking at different groups. And this from one of his studies, the manipulation. I just want to highlight this here. But they had people in online service read this kind of text, and then they had the manipulations in there that one condition would say that, in this case, Muslim Americans identify mainly as Americans, the American identity, or in another condition, similar information, but then that they identify mainly or to the same extent with both the majority, the Muslim and their American identity, and then they would see these kind of extreme graphs where in this one condition, 80% or so argued and responded in a survey that they mainly identify as American, or 80% responded that they mainly identify as both American and Muslim to the same extent, and then they have also always a condition that they identify mainly as Muslims. This is not really the target group that I'm interested in, Muslim Americans, right? Because we are more thinking about immigrants in the European context. This is also what in the psychology research would be more called cross-categorization, that people belong to different identities that are unrelated, like a religious identity and an ethnic identity or a national identity. But for us, what we're interested in is this identification on the same dimension, to what extent you feel Moroccan or Dutch or Moroccan Dutch. But anyway, so they have one experiment where they looked at this, where they had, and I'm showing you here the results of that. I don't have the manipulation for that, but it's the same setup basically, but then for Mexican Americans instead of Muslim Americans. And so what they found in their study, was published last year, is very small effect basically. So this is here comparing the, whoa, I should not touch it. Do I touch it again? Or?
You can double click on the slide and then, yeah.
Whoa, okay. Okay, so anyway, so how do I do this now? I stay here. Oh, wait, I have a, does this work? Can't see. Anyway, so the gray bar is the American identity condition that they mainly identify as Americans. The red bar is the dual identity, Mexican and American to the same extent. And there's basically nothing happening here between those. And also what they find, the only contrast that's significant is between the Mexican identity conditions, where they showed people that they mainly identify as Mexican, versus the American identity condition, where they show that they identify mainly as American. There's more movement going on over here with to what extent they think that these Mexican Americans are Mexican, but to what extent they ascribe them belonging to the in-group, very little is happening in this particular experiment. And so, yeah, so also that's, oh yeah, then they look to what extent this translates into more positive or negative attitudes towards Mexican Americans. And they find that there are more negative attitudes towards Mexican Americans in this Mexican condition, where they have manipulated and told the people that they mainly identify as Mexican and not as American, than an American identity condition. But there's really nothing going on compared to the control condition, right? So it's more like if you tell them that an immigrant group identifies mainly as belonging to the immigrant group, then there's a negative effect, but nothing the other way around. And to some extent, they found still, but it's not really a consequence of this manipulation, but still they find that if people more strongly ascribe this dual identity to Mexican Americans, then they have, in general, more positive attitudes towards Mexicans outside of America, so this gateway group effect. that they hypothesized about, but this is not really a consequence of their manipulation. It's more like people who, in general, ascribe more dual identity have more positive attitudes. Now, okay, so this is where we come from. We were, since this is not our target group, not our context, we were interested what happens
So
in.
what is this experimental manipulation? I missed probably the previous.
Oh, so this was
manipulation.
this one here. Right, so here it was with Muslim Americans, but there it was with Mexican American, the same thing.
Okay.
I just don't have their actual manipulation. But they have, like in this paper, 3 studies, 2 about Muslim Americans, 1 about Mexican Americans, but it's the same thing. Basically, they show that people identify mainly as American, or as, to some extent, as Mexican and American, and to a certain extent as mainly as Mexican.
But how are the groups being manipulated, or like?
So this is an online survey. People put like American majority group members, white Americans in this case, participate in this online service, and they're basically just giving this text to read, being told this is a new study, and they're supposed to read this. That's the manipulation, right? So some of them see the information that the Mexican Americans mainly identify as Mexican. Some of them see that they mainly identify as American. And then they look, subsequently have multiple measures for prejudice, these kind of things, and see how do the groups have read this text or that text differ from each other. Okay,
Thanks.
so we tried something similar in the Netherlands. Whoops. A much shorter manipulation, but also an online study with Dutch majority group members who themselves and their parents are born in the Netherlands, where we basically gave them either this information or in-group identity condition that a majority of the second generation Moroccan Dutch people feels Dutch. Their parents come from Morocco, but they are born in the Netherlands, so it's just background information. Then 72% of a representative sample identifies equally strongly or even stronger as Dutch than as Moroccan. This has been shown by recent research by the SCP. Or they've been in the dual identity condition, which appears now, which is basically the same text, but then it says that the majority feels equally strongly Dutch and Moroccan, and that more than 50% of representatives identify equally strongly as Dutch. And this was accompanied by the actual numbers. So in the in-group identity condition, you can see that here it is 72% who identifies as Dutch, strongly Dutch, or stronger. This is the group that identifies strongly as Moroccan, and then there's one who is neither the one nor the other. And then in the dual identity condition, this is basically split up into those who said stronger Dutch than Moroccan or equally strong. So that it's just like the same group is either put together here or they're split up. When we looked like what's the effect on to what extent they see after reading this information, people who are second generation Moroccan Dutch as Dutch or Moroccan, right? So this was the question of, well, in your view, how Dutch are people who are born in this here in this country, but their parents immigrated from Morocco, and there's very little happening in to what extent they're seeing as Dutch. So there's one marginally significant effect, so a p-value between 0.05 and 0.1 between the control condition where it didn't get any information and the Dutch identity condition. And there's more happening over here with the Moroccan identity, so that people who have when they get this information that the majority identifies as Dutch, they see them significantly less Moroccan than in the other conditions.
And
so
if you there's no out-group conditioning, I don't like that.
No,
that they're given that they feel more Moroccan.
Yes, no, I did not. I don't like to use deception. So, and I find this is a very sensitive subject and anyway, so I didn't want to like produce something that's not true in this case, that the majority of them would identify as Moroccan. Even if you debrief people, I don't think people read the briefings. So I stayed away from this negative framing. It's just control group versus either dual identity or in-group identity. I find this very problematic what they did in the other studies, but that's just. So after this, we also asked people their attitudes. There's a feeling thermometer towards Moroccans in the Netherlands. This is gateway group thing, and there we actually do find a significant effect between the dual identity condition and the control conditions. Control where they didn't get any information. So if people set this information that more than 50% feels equally strongly Dutch and Moroccan, they actually report later more positive feelings towards Moroccans in the Netherlands than in the control condition. And this effect, like this contrast, looks similar, but it's not reaching significance in our study. But this would basically support this gateway group notion that I mentioned earlier. And also this whole idea where our project started, that if people realize that others, that the minority group identifies both as in-group and out-group, that this can improve into attitudes.
So just to understand correctly, that those who receive this dual identity condition have more positive even than those who receive the Dutch identity condition?
Well, this is not statistically significant, but yes, yes, that's what comes out of it. But if they see that they identify, I mean, the idea here would be that only the group that still feels that it belongs also to the minority group can improve your attitudes toward the minority, or they do it at least more strongly. So that would be a little bit this what's behind. So
who are the people who are receiving this like this survey
So this is an opt-in panel, but it's a national representative sample of the Dutch who signed up for one of these online panels that you can like buy time into to feel these things. But it's a randomization behind it. So it's Dutch majority members who signed up for such an online sample. So this is on the group level, right? So this is the idea that if you get information that a group, a minority group identifies more strongly also belonging to your group, our group, that does something. But we were also interested in.
I'm having trouble understanding, because the only difference between these three conditions is which information is fed to them.
Yes.
But then it's not necessarily showing something about identity, but about the information you fed something.
Yes. You're onto something. Yes. Bear with me. We'll get there. Yes.
Yeah.
So this is also, so if you tell them that people identify more, so this is the idea. But if you tell people that, in this case, Moroccan Dutch people who are very stigmatized in our country, unfortunately, that they identify, how strongly they identify as Dutch or as both, then we see an effect on what people think about Moroccans.
Yeah.
But it's like, if we tell them this, and this is actually where I'm getting to, like what you're on to. So because we were interested in so this is like this group thing. If I tell them the group does this, but what's about actual interactions with people, right? This example where I started with this one soccer player. Yes.
Sorry, so in the previous graph, does that mean that telling them that they feel completely Dutch and telling them that...
Ja. Want er was behoorlijk toch al wel behoorlijk wat input voor die discussie, maar was dat ook van jou? Onder andere of niet?
There we go.
Okay.
That does not make a difference, that like telling the people that they're completely like they're Dutch Moroccan, or that they feel completely Dutch, that does not make any difference.
Well, it does make a difference, at least a marginal significant difference, to what extent people consider them being Dutch. So that's this thing here, right? There is something going on. Maybe our sample is too small to see it really, but here we don't really see a big difference. I mean, this contrast is not significant, but again, the sample is fairly small. So you know, it's so the argument of this gateway group research, our Levy that I said earlier, is always that what drives the effect is basically that people are considered also to be in-group members if they have this dual identity. So then they would expect actually no difference between this and that part. Okay, so where I was going was the individual effect, right? So the soccer player was just one person. And it's also, typically we don't get this information about a whole group kind of thing, right? But you have interactions with people in your daily basis. So there's this whole line of research in sociology and social psychology on intergroup contact, the idea that, is this where I want to go? Yes, so there's the idea that if you have contact with a member of another group, minority group typically, then over time your attitudes towards that group will improve through all kinds of mediation processes. And we were interesting, like what's the difference between having contact with a dual identifier and mono identifier? And this to what the difference between having contact with a Moroccan person who identifies as Moroccan Dutch or a person who identifies as Moroccan. Because in the literature, nobody has looked at these kind of processes.
The question.
Yes.
So your hypothesis is that if you're a Dutch person, like natively Dutch,
Yes.
and you come in contact with a dual identity person, then you will develop positive attitudes towards the minority group as a whole.
Yes.
That's the hypothesis.
That's the hypothesis.
Okay.
Yes. So we did it in 2 different ways. So this is so this is the idea. So what's the difference between dual identity context? So what we did is again in a representative online sample opt-in panel, we added in an egocentric network stuff. So this is the idea basically that you ask the participants in this survey to give you the names of 5 friends, for example, and then you can ask follow-up questions about these friends. And this way you get a sense of the network they're embedded. So in this study, we have for Dutch members, again, we have asked them first, do we have friends with a migration background? That's the first thing. Right? And if they said yes, then we ask them, can you give us please the names of 5 of these friends so that we can ask you subsequent questions about these people. And then after we got those names, they were presented with this scale, basically an question for each of these 5 people. How would you describe person 1, for example, as on this scale from I see him as only Dutch, more Dutch, Dutch and Moroccan equally, for example. If they said that this person is from Morocco, I see him more Moroccan or I see him only as Moroccan. Right? So for each of these people. And from that, we calculate basically how many of your friends are only or main, or do you consider as only or mainly minority members? And how many of them do you consider as dual identifiers in this space? And then the dependent variable that we asked after this exercise in general is, again, such a feeling thermometer in which we asked, what are your feelings towards people with a migration background in general? It's called a feeling thermometer because it's a scale from 0 to 100, and you give on like how warm you feel, cold towards these people. And so because I have so much to tell you, I don't bore you with the details. I'll just give you the regression coefficients now. So what we see is basically we enter both the number of ethnic outgroup identifiers in your egocentric network as a predictor and the number of the dual identifying outgroup friends. And we only see an effect of this and not of that. And the effect is also significantly stronger of having the more dual identifying friends you have in your friendship group, the more positive are your attitudes towards migrants. But the effect of having more outgroup identified friends is not there. Yes.
So where did you put the boundary to categorize a person as a purely outgroup identifier?
So in this case, it was these 2 categories that you consider this person more Moroccan than Dutch or only Moroccan, or you would categorize them. And this is the dual thing. And these people we consider as in-group. But if you say they have a migration background, but I see them as only Dutch or more Dutch, then we don't consider them as an.
So you don't count basically the 1 and 2 responses.
Right.
And then the 3 responses go into dual identifiers.
Right.
Yeah. And what's the division, like the absolute numbers here? How many people actually report a thing?
I honestly don't know. So this is work with my postdoc, and this is one of the studies will still work in progress. So I don't know at the moment the detail of these kind of questions. Yeah. So this is just what we have at the moment.
Yeah.
But this would be in line with like the bigger theory that we have in mind, that you have that having contact with these people that you consider to belong both to the in-group and out-group actually does something with the attitudes. And this is what the original contact effect is mainly about, just with out-group members. But this at least suggests there could be this people may make a distinction between out-group members that they really consider just out-group and some of them that they consider also to be good. Yes.
How do you like categorize a positive attitude, for example?
So the dependent variable is just a scale, right? It's a scale from 0 to 100 with values lower than 50 mean negative attitudes, higher than 50 mean positive attitudes. And we just see in this case, the more of these dual identifying outgroup friends people have, the higher they score on that scale. Yes.
Do I understand correct that if you have like purely outgroup friends, your positive attitude towards them is less than if you have dual friends?
Yes.
That's really weird, right?
Well, not if you believe that these dual identifier really do something.
But if your friends are outgroup, why would you then not have a positive attitude towards them?
But it's a flat, the correlation is flat, right? It's not negative, so it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Just, it doesn't apparently matter. I also find it weird, so this is why I asked about the number, maybe just the number of sort of Dutch people who have actual friends who, with a migration background who don't identify as Dutch, maybe is quite low. Like that the number of.
Yeah, it could be that people, there's also work, studies that I've published, and so at least this was with school children, and we also showed that they prefer to befriend minority members who more strongly identify with the majority group.
Yeah.
So there could be a bias in that sense, that the Dutch people don't have a lot of those in the first place.
Yeah.
But it still tells us something that at least there's a certain type of outgroup member that's being befriended, and that affects attitudes, and that's something we don't really take into account. So this was the first study that's still work in progress. The second study is still work in progress, which also looking in this thing takes a different approach. We use school data that has been collected in Germany by colleagues, FIS data. And this is one of these studies where for each school grade, they presented the kids with the names of all the kids in the grade and asked like, who are your friends? So they could mark their friends in there. And then they asked all the students who have a background, like they were first asked, do you have a migration background or your family? And then they were asked, how do you see yourself? Right. So in this case, it's not the identity being ascribed to them or somebody tells them, it's really self-reported, how they see themselves. Again, a scale, in this case, from only German to only as a person from my family's country of origin, and both equally in the middle, right? So in this case, we use their self-identification to make a distinction between how many of your friends are dual identifiers and how many of your friends are mainly or purely outgroup. And then again, we have this data, they also have a feeling thermometer towards Turkish people in Germany, and we are looking now only at contact with people, students with a Turkish background, because they were oversampled in this study. So a large majority group of Turkish Germans in the data for which we can look at this thing. And we did basically a similar thing, except for that this now panel analysis, because there were 5 observations over time, so we can look more at getting closer to a causal effect of having contact with these people. So we have for 825 native German students the effect of the change in number of mono-identifying Turkish friends, or mainly identifying Turkish friends, and change number of dual-identifying friends. And here we find the opposite. Right, so here it's actually the more dual-identifying Turkish friends you have over time, this doesn't really do anything with your attitudes. But the more mono-identifying Turkish friends you have, over time, they develop more positive attitudes. I cannot tell you the numbers. So.
Okay. I was going to ask a question. I was going to ask, this is about the self-identification of the children, right?
Yes.
And the other study was about how do you see
Yes.
your friends?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the big difference.
Yeah.
And that's also where it gets to the question that you asked earlier, because we told them how they identify. In this case, in the first study, it was about ascribed identity. How do you see your friends? In this case, it's how do the friends see yourself? And we have no idea if you agree with them or you do realize how your friends is. And this is what brings me to the second part of our research project. And this is the challenge of dual identification. So just as an illustration, so this is a picture of a TV show that was on by BNN Vara, I think 2 years ago or so, the Poldermokkos. So these are about a group of young people who were raised in the Netherlands. Most of them also born in the Netherlands. They all have a Moroccan migration background. And in this show, they took them back to Morocco to experience like the country of origin, and they did some challenges there. But what's interesting about this show is like they had a lot of conversations amongst each other, how they deal with their dual belonging. And that they have experienced quite some challenges from mainly the Dutch majority. They're not really considered a real Dutch person. They're still being called Moroccans, even though they're born and raised in the Netherlands. But also among the ethnic minority, that are being called Tatars, which is like a derogatory term for Dutch people, or a cheesehead or something like that, because they affiliate too much with Dutch people, for example. And because of that, there's this qualitative work into that. A lot of people with this dual identity actually hide their dual belonging in certain situations to avoid questions of their loyalty, for example, and their belonging. So that brings us, of course, to the thing, like in this previous study that I showed, we don't know if their friends realize the self-identification of their kids. In my own work, when I still had time to go to school classes and collect data, I also had instances where we asked these questions: to what extent do you feel Dutch? To what extent do you feel Moroccan, for example, to kids in our questionnaire? That kids said to me, I don't know how to respond to this question, because in school I feel Dutch, but at home I feel Moroccan. And that, of course, means whatever she said doesn't necessarily imply that her friends realize that.
Did you also check the sort of the control group, like how Dutch people feel about Dutch people? Because I'm wondering, like, this is also what I'm wondering when I'm asking this question, like, do I feel Dutch? I'm not sure. I'm born here, I've grown up here, but I don't necessarily feel super Dutch compared to people from Friesland, let's say.
Okay.
So I'm wondering how this scales to say, you just ask the same question to only Dutch people about.
Oh, okay, now I get it. Okay, so yes, so we do ask the strengths of your national identification very often as a sort of moderator of these effects, because there's research showing that people who are very strongly identify with national group, then we're getting deterrence of nationalism. These kind of things very often are more negative towards immigrants. But if you say, I'm very proud of being Dutch, these kinds of people respond like this, they're very often very negative towards immigrant. And we have this in a lot of our studies as a moderator, where we're also interested in whatever our manipulations do, if they are less effective, for example, for people who are very strongly identified with the Netherlands.
And that's the case.
That's a case in the one study that we've done it so far.
Yeah.
Right, we're only in the middle of the project, so we've seen it once, and it was this study here, the school study. So this was not a representative sample at all. But so this is a study we did in RSCs, community colleges or the educational training schools where you can really learn a profession. Because they're highly ethnically diverse, typically, and so this is a sample about 400 participants, where we should not show this before I tell you the story. So don't look at it because it's just confusing at the moment. So we asked in this questionnaire to what extent each student identified as Dutch on a scale and identified as belonging to the migration group of their parents, if they had one. And that gives us a sense of how many of the kids with a dual identity, with a migration background, have a dual identity. And this was in this case about 64% of the kids were second generation, right? Their parents migrated to the Netherlands, born and raised here. 64% of them identified roughly equally strongly as Dutch and as members of the migration group of their parents, right? And then we asked for all their classmates, so they got a list again with all the names of all their classmates on it, to indicate for each of those classmates to what groups they think they belong to, which cultures they think they belong. And there were examples, so some people see themselves as Moroccan, others see themselves as Moroccan Dutch, others see themselves only as Dutch. How do you see each of your classmates? And so they could indicate for all the classmates how they see them. And what we did then, we looked for all these, the second generation people, so all the classmates that had a migration background, their parents migrated to the Netherlands, what kind of identities ascribed to them by their classmates. And this is what's shown here, basically. So of the second generation migrants, you see up here, this is the percentage of dual ascriptions that they received. This is the percentage of only minority description that they received, and this is the percentage of only majority description they received. And then it's split up by the self-identification of the observer. So this is basically what people are self-identified as only Dutch said about the second generation. This is what the kids who only self-identified as belong to a minority group said, and this is what the dual identifier said, which all of them look very similar, right? It doesn't really matter what you look at. And it's quite striking, right? So 64% identify as dual, belonging to equal extent to a Dutch majority and to a minority group, but about 70% of getting ascribed minority belonging. And it really doesn't matter what your own identification is. So also those who self-identify as dual don't ascribe it more often than those who don't identify as dual or majority members. And that, of course, brings us to the point, like, whatever you think of yourself, it might not really affect how people see you.
Well, I mean, in this particular group of people.
In this particular group of people.
Because I'm wondering if you do this the same for 10 years later as adults, if this changes. Because you're looking at very young adults, right? Like
Yeah,
15.
16 to 22 or so.
Yeah.
Right? This is the age group. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. Could change. So here in this study, we're mainly also interested in, so what drives then dual ascription? So why what characteristics of the observer might explain that people are more likely to give these dual ascriptions? And there we're looking at, for example, national identification, where we actually do find that people who more strongly identify as Dutch are more likely to ascribe them to belong to the national majority group than to the dual group. There seems to be like a bias that you don't want to. It could be something like it that you don't want to intermingle these groups, so and rather see them as in-group members than as some form of mix. But nonetheless, so I'll mainly present this as a wake-up call also for us, because we were also really surprised to get these kind of numbers, that this dual ascription is so low and that people seem to not really see this. We were also wondering whether it's a methodological bug, so we have now a different way of asking for this kind of thing, but we also did qualitative work in this target group. So a postdoc of mine did quite a lot of in-depth interviews with students from these different groups to really understand how do they deal with ethnic and national belonging, how do they make sense of these different groups, and what comes out of this is also we're very much in line with this, that this dual is not really a thing that this target group at least has in mind very much when they think about belonging. If at all, then it's about heritage, and if you have one of your parents is Dutch and the other parent has a migration background. Yes.
What about the role of the social context? Because here, what you portray is the configurations at the educational level, right?
Yeah.
But as we understand that the social network is kind of multi-layer and multi-dimensional, in which that there is kind of the intertwined layer between these educations and the other type of relations, for example, the friendship and other kind of social context. And do you think that you should portray this kind of the similar configurations when you try to capture from the different perspective?
Very good question. So what we are planning now a bigger data collection at the end of this calendar year, a two-wave of study. Also, we want to see how things develop over time. And one important element of this also get a sense of people's, in this case also students' background networks outside of the school context, particularly whether they interact also outside of school context. Because it could very well be that you express a different identity outside of school than inside of school. Mm. And if you interact outside there, then you might be much better at recognizing people's dual belonging or dual identities. Yes. Mm. So yeah, we're trying to get a sense of this. What what are the social networks that you're engaged in, and where you're engaged in, the context, how this affects these ascriptions.
And like also in different school levels. So in this case, as I was saying,
Yes, so the aim is to again have a big RSA sample. We want to split it up because this is all done in the Randstad. To have a Randstad sample, a medium-sized sample, and then the Achtung, right? So really remote kind of thing, where you have really different ethnic composition outside what you engaged in, plus a high school sample of what is it, class 5 and 6, right? So the same age group, 16 plus, but then higher educated, much less diverse, to see whether there are differences as well. Yeah. All right. So yes.
So these students that you're surveying, you said that they were in apprenticeships. Is that what you said?
Yeah, schools where they're in apprenticeships, they get training.
They're not universities.
No.
So in the United States, so what people usually observe is second generation tends to be more university. Right? Like for example, if you have people from Central America, from Mexico, who emigrated to the States, the children tend to be, tend to go to university at a higher rate. So is it possible that, if you were to ask the same question to university students, the response would be different, that you would have more, dual identification ascribed?
It could very well be, right? Because it's a very complex thing also to negotiate in your mind, right? The dual identity is much easier. There's a lot of research with biracial people in the US context, particularly, that they are mainly ascribed belonging, they're black instead of if this is a minority group, because that's just easier than this complex biracial category. So it could very well be that we see that there's a difference. That's why we're interested in this high school cohort as well, because they are same age group, but then typically higher cognitive capacities. For this particular research, it's just the case that we need, if you ask like ascription of identities to people you know in your network, you need a diverse network. Right? And unfortunately, at least the university I'm teaching is very white. There's not a lot of diversity going on. So this kind of research is not really something that we could do there very easily. But it could be very well. And I hope to get a sense of this by looking at this. I really also think that the context matters, right? If you grow up in the Randstad where just diversity is so normal, that people also are more fine with it. I remember when I collected data in a while ago, but in Rotterdam, in primary schools, and then in this highly ethnically diverse schools, none of the students ever asked me about my accent, right? But as soon as I came into one of these predominantly white Dutch primary schools, like immediately one of the students said, like, "Meneer, are you German?" Which is completely fine, but I think also they're so used in some contexts, if you're in a very diverse context, they're used to accents and to have this diversity, and that's completely fine to say this person is Turkish, so without feeling that you are like denying them anything. Because you also have migration background, perhaps it's these kind of things. But if you're in a Dutch context, predominantly Dutch, then that might be very different. We're trying to get a sense of these kind of things. Okay, so I have to slide back in here because like this is what the framing is basically, does this even work, right? The whole idea that we have today are seeing in-group members and out-group members at the same time if people don't realize it. Right, so this drives me to the second research aim that we have in this project, trying to understand what drives this recognition of dual belonging. Because there has been a lot of work on, as I said earlier, how people deal with dual identity, how they negotiate their own identity, and how they deal with the denial of an identity, for example. But there's barely any work on understanding why people ascribe sometimes dual identity or not. And there's some work on, as I said, on biracial people, mainly in the US. But the big difference here is, of course, that they have very often a phenotypical cue of their dual belonging, while children of immigrants don't, right? They just look like someone from the country of origin of their parents. So what we did now, a couple of studies, also online survey experiments, where we tried to look at a different dimension that might matter. So one of them is self-identification, right? If you're explicitly being told people's identity, how does this affect how you see them? And so we did an experiment in which we told people a very short story about a person and asked questions about that person. So yeah, this information was, I'm Kerem, I'm 25 years old, my parents are from Turkey. I moved to the Netherlands, sorry, they moved to the Netherlands in 1993. For my entire life, I've lived in the city of Utrecht. That's the control condition. And then in the national identity condition, they additionally got this information. People often ask me whether I feel Dutch. Well, certainly I feel Dutch. After I was raised here, I feel completely at home in the Netherlands. We had a condition to what extent Kerem ascribes to a national norm that's widely shared. So they didn't see the orange thing, they only got then the green thing. That he has a full-time job and is committed to working hard. That's based on the idea of self-categorization theory. That's to what extent, to the extent that you consider someone more in line with the prototypical idea and ascribing to in-group norms, the more strongly I see this person as an in-group member. And because working hard is a norm that's being endorsed in this country, at least for the Protestant work ethic, we thought this might matter. And then we had the third condition where they got basically full text, so most of those information. And again, in this case, our dependent variables, in your view, how Dutch is cared. And it was the same setup, like between subject to sign, people only got either this, the control condition, or this, or that, or the whole thing. And these are the results. So this control condition, and these are they only got the information that he identifies Dutch, only got the addition as hard worker. There's no difference between these two conditions, or they got both of this information. And so there's all of them are significantly different from the control condition, and then if you get both information, it's even more like a more stronger ascription of Dutchness to Kerem than in the other conditions. Which suggests that if people get information about the self-identification of a person, they seem to follow that to some extent. But also this idea that if someone subscribes to the national norm might actually do something, and there's some reason on the deservingness of migrants that could also lead to this, like if you're hardworking, contributing to society, paying your taxes, that you're more deserving of citizenship. This is the other research about, but in this case also national belonging. And it suggests, of course, a double standard, right? That migrants have to do more than Dutch people to being seen Dutch in there. But as you notice, so in this particular study, we don't have a dual identity condition, and we were also interested in what's the consequence of that. So we run a similar experiment, in this case about Ibrahim, in which we don't have information about his hard working, but similar setup. He's born and raised in Delft, or the Netherlands. He lives in Delft, and then we have 4 different conditions. Either they consider that's why I see myself mainly as Dutch. That's why I see myself mainly as Moroccan and Dutchman, both equally. That's how I see myself mainly as a Moroccan Dutchman, Marokkaanse Nederlander, right? And I see myself mainly as Moroccan. And these are just 2 different expressions of your dual identity. Where we're interested, doesn't matter, but you hyphenate your identity as I'm Moroccan Dutch, or whether you like just say I'm both equally. And then again, similar dependent variable to what extent you see Ibrahim as a Dutch person or Moroccan. And these are the results. So again, a lot of numbers here. This is about the strengths of Dutch identity that's being ascribed with the strength of Moroccan identity overall. In the middle are these 2 dual identity conditions, and they are not significantly different from each other. So we sort of collapse them here now, like with others. But you can see that compared to the Moroccan identity condition, there's significantly more strongly ascribed the Dutch identity if they identify as dual, and even stronger if they mainly identify as Dutch. And we see the opposite pattern for Moroccan identity, that's the strength to which someone is ascribed Moroccan identity. So again, so coming back to the original question that I asked, like, what makes people then ascribe dual belonging or national majority belonging? The self-identification, explicit self-identification, if you have that information, strongly affects how people see other people.
But the way I see it is framing, right? Because I feel like to acquire citizenship here, you do the in-person exam. There's a question on there: what do Dutch people give each other on their birthdays? And the answer is tulips. And if I read that question, I go like, I don't identify with this at all. Never heard anybody do this to anybody else. So in that context, I would say I don't feel Dutch at all. But if you then ask me, somebody else asked me from a different country, oh, where can you get good cheese? What's a country with good cuisine? Wouldn't be Dutch, right? So it's like, it's the framing that kind of sets up also the way you identify. And I think that's also what you show here, is that the framing of the text you give also gives you a sense of identity.
It's the other person's identity, right, not your own.
Yeah, but it works both ways, I guess.
I'm not entirely sure that I follow. So what we do show is clearly like if a person frames the context or situation as I'm Dutch,
Yeah.
that affects to what extent whether people are willing or not to follow that identification.
Yes, but if they would write a lot like I hate Dutch people, the Dutch culture sucks, all these kind of things, they would probably say no.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So also because in this case, right, for this bar, he identifies mainly as Moroccan.
Yeah.
That also means that they ascribe much less Dutchness to that person,
Yeah.
significantly less. Not zero or not one, right? There's still something because the person is still born and raised in the Netherlands, has a Dutch passport because of that, but it's significantly less seen as Dutch.
Yeah. I'm struggling to understand because I think like the meaning you ascribe to the situation is different, even for me as a Dutch person. It's like
But so
I identify
I'm not,
as being Dutch depending on the context that I'm in.
but we're not really framing a lot here, right? We're just, this is the only information that I get. That's me. I'm born, I live in Delft, I'm 30 years. My parents came from Morocco, but I'm born and raised in the Netherlands. That's all. And then the only thing that we vary is this last sentence here.
But this is completely framed, right? You could also say I'm 30 years old, dot. Then you're not framing the rest. You're just saying my name is something, and I'm this old, this years old. And or you could frame on different aspects, like I like to play soccer or whatever.
Yeah, sure. No, but that's what we want to do, right? We want to see, like, if we tell people that explicit self-identification, how does this affect them? Because we're still trying to understand under what circumstances, or why do people sometimes ascribe dual belonging or in-group belonging, or to one they don't do that. And that's framing. We have a lot more to come, like, so this is, sorry, because it's building on this, a lot more framing kind of things. So these are experiments in preparation at the moment, where we want to understand, like, as next aspect, it's not just your self-identification, but also sort of group signals that you might send either deliberately or undeliberately, and to what extent they are being picked up. And so we're interested in, if you have no information about self-identification, how else does how you see people affect how you ascribe them certain belonging. And this is about, for example, religious symbols, where we have AI-generated pictures either with hijab or not. And this is about national symbols, where someone has like a Moroccan appearance, we pretest that, either wears like a Dutch soccer shirt or not. We're also looking at a condition where we look at the effect of high versus low status clothing. I want to see to what extent does this affect your ascription of belonging or of being Dutch again to these people. If you have only the information that they are born and raised in this country, but have a migration background. Right? Framing all of this, but this is really what we try to understand. How does this affect people's attitudes? And in the interest of time, I'll go through it quickly. So another thing that is in preparation at the moment is where another form of signal that people might pick up to ascribe belonging to people could be a social signal. And that's the information that you have about the social network, the embeddedness of a person. very interested in if you have these network pictures that I showed you earlier, where they could have bridge positions, for example, between two different groups, does this affect how you see them as belonging to both groups? Or if you have the information that they only belong to this one group or the other group, does this affect how you see them? And this was also inspired by this TV show, Golden Mockers, that I mentioned earlier, where one of them also said that he's very often called Cheese by his Moroccan acquaintances because he has so many Dutch friends, and that he thinks, or the others think him too much as a cheese. So what we do is, or what we intend to do in this study is basically have two study design that's very similar, in which we give people again information about a person, and then in study one we would tell them the names of the 4 friends of that person, and then we have conditions for all the friends have a Dutch name, a Moroccan name, or a mixed name. And what I want to show you now is basically the same setup, but then with pictures, where we would present them with text like this. The next question is about a fictitious person that you can see below. He's 30 years old, born, raised in the Netherlands, but parents came from Morocco. And we would like to know your impression of it. And then as part of the experiment, they then see this information. But here you can see him with his 2 best friends. They know each other from their football club where they like to play football together. His friends are very important to them. And then the only thing that we would vary in this experiment would be the composition of the friendship group. So here's this person again, and then 2 people that previous showed are identified as Dutch. And then we have a mixed condition where one friend is identified as Dutch, one is Moroccan, and so this is over here. And then a condition where both friends have more Moroccan appearance according to our pre-test. And again, the question, like, in your view, how Dutch is this person? To get a sense of, does the social signal affect the amount of description people give to someone else? All right. And now I'll come to the cool part that I wanted to show if I have a couple of more minutes. So I mean, this is all of this is cool, of course. So, but we are interested in these social signals in real life, right? So this is all experimental manipulation where it's very artificial. We show people, oh, this is the only information they get to have to base their answers on something like this. So, but to test particularly these kind of signals, to what extent they are being picked up, and then particularly the social signals, we want to know, like in real life out there, to what extent do these signals affect how people see others. So if people are seen to occupy this bridge position between groups, does this increase description of dual belonging? Or if they are embedded, seen as being embedded maybe in the majority group network or the minority group network, does this affect, again, how they are seen? So what do we need for that? We need your perception of someone's position in a social network, and you need, of course, your ascription of ethnic national belonging of the people in the network. And then we have a problem because typically we don't have that. Right? So in the traditional social network analysis, where's my background is, we typically go, for example, in school classes, and then you ask everyone in that class, who are your friends? And from that, we can construct the social network in class. Right? Then if you have self-identification, for example, I belong to the blue group, I belong to the red group, and I equally belong to both groups, then we could basically look like what are the in-group friendships, so dual identifiers are in there. But then we are back at this problem that we have. I have no idea if this person knows that this one is a dual identifier or not. And even further, I don't know if this person realized that they see each other as friends or not. Right? This is an assumption that we do make in most of social network analysis, that people have perfect information of the structure of the network and the characteristics of the people in the network. And it's a very strong assumption. And there's some research in the field, it's called cognitive social structures, where they measured people's perception of how a network looked and compared to some gold standard that they have. And they also, what I typically find is that people are really bad at that, at realizing who is friends with whom in a context. And they overestimate network closure, like triadic structures and so on in the network. Yeah, so that's what I said. So where we want to go next is perceived social networks. So instead of just focusing on like who are you reporting to be friends, is really asking for everyone in a classmate, who do you think Tom's friends are? Who do you think think Jeroen's friends are? Who do you think Marie's friends are? And that way, I get for every person who is in a social context, their perception of the structure of the network. And that, that relaxes this assumption of perfect information that we have. But the problem here is that these perceptions of networks are not independent from each other, but people who are friends with each other are more likely to have similar perception of the network. And that brings us to a structure that's called networks of networks. In there, and they are not. We don't really have statistical models to analyze them. There's some development going on at the moment for cross-sectional networks, and I've started to collaborate with Nienke Niesink, who also got a PhD in Groningen, let's say. No, you were postdoc there, right? Sorry, but you know Nienke then probably? No, okay, so you might. She's in Carnegie Mellon now, but she's actually working on these problems. She's a statistician. We try to develop the statistical models to analyze this and taking care of the dependency structure here to really understand what is the role of how you think people are embedded in the social network for how you see them, how you describe their identity. And that's, of course, something that is also interesting potentially to the bigger field of social network analysis outside of interethnic relations, because we can, if we succeed to of perfect information there, but really built on the actual information or actual perception people have of the social network they're embedded in. The problem that we have, and that we are solving at the moment, is that we don't really have tools to collect these perceptions of social networks. So in the field that I mentioned earlier, the cognitive social structure, what they typically do, they give people matrices with the names on top and names on and have a roster for the entire like n by n matrix and ask them to put like a 1 or so an X into the cell and 2 people are friends. And that's, of course, I mean, you can imagine this is cognitive quite demanding to do this kind of thing. So we've developed a new software to collect these kind of perceptions on smartphones in school classes. And at the moment we call it a compact network interface. I want to still think about the name, I'm not sure. But the idea is that we have a new software to collect both whole networks, like school class networks, for example, or also egocentric networks with this one software that you can use. I just want to show you a glimpse of what it is. So how it's set up at the moment is that at the very beginning, if you start in a school class, for example, the very first question that kids get after giving informed consent is to enter their names, their own name in this case. And is then uploaded to a server and then populates later on questions about the social network in the school classes. So these are all the names that kids put in basically at the beginning of the questionnaire. And then everybody gets to see the whole list of classmates, and then we can ask questions about them. But it's way too small for you to see, but it's also in Dutch, but it's basically just a question like, who are your friends? And then kids can, participants can interact with the software by clicking on the names of the friends, and then they appear up there. So this is work that Tom Nice did mainly, postdoc in my project, and he did it together with in a co-creation process also with students from the Grafisch Lyceum in Utrecht. So they're really at the game design study. I have really cool ideas to do that. And so this is a normal network question, like who are your friends? And then what you can also do in this question is now ask for everyone in the class, who do you think are the friends of, in this case, Anne? Right, so you get to see this question, and then again, you can interact. And so if you think that who are the friends of Anne, you can click on them, and then they should move up there, exactly. And then when you're done with all of Anne's friends, you could scroll down to the arrow that's down there. So click next. And then Anne disappears up there. And then the next person's name appears up there. And then you're being asked a question about the next person and that. And while you do that, this list gets shorter and shorter, right? Because if you already told me that Anne is friend with Eva, you don't have to tell me that Eva is friend with Anne. In that sense. And that speeds up this process considerably. But we have to explain to people that we do that because it's a bit confusing. We learned in pretests. But in the end, you get a situation like this where there are very few names left. And then, of course, very unlikely that they are friends with each other, just because so that in the end you're fairly quick with getting through the end of the questionnaire.
That's assuming all friendship is reciprocal.
That's assuming in your head
Yeah.
you would consider them, think that they are friends only if you think they're both friends with each other. But indeed, that's something that if you would allow like ties in both direction, that ask it again would take much longer.
Yeah.
But you could test these kind of things. We have a lot of ideas for tests that we could do with that.
Do sometimes people do not enter anything, like it just makes their own? This person has no friends.
Well, it doesn't, but this is the problem, right? It doesn't mean it has no friends, because you may have already mentioned that person earlier as a friend of someone else. But this is the problem that we get there, that people have like, but this person has friends, and now I click next, indicating he doesn't have friends, although you already said that. So that's the struggle we have at the moment. So we have, if you go in class, we have videos explaining to kids or the participants what's happening and why this is happening, in the hope to not get into these situations, so that they understand. They're not saying that it doesn't have friends. But it speeds up the process immensely if you don't have to indicate for everyone again that they are friends with each other, right? So that's the struggle. But it's also one of the ideas that we have for future work, to do just a methodological paper and try out these different options and what happens.
And you can't just show them the network you're building. But you can make it and show it, right?
Yeah, you could do that. I'm not really a fan of that, because people don't, most people have never seen a network picture, so they don't really know what it means. I have no conception of that. And also on a smartphone, you have the problem again, you would have to zoom in a lot to even be able to read the names and so. So I don't know. So what we also have in there, just normal questions that you can ask about everyone in the class. In this case, it's just a political opinion, but then so the response option basically flies out there to the name, and then they both fly out, and you can ask about the next person. And this is the design that we also will use for the perceived ethnicity of people. Basically, a two-step approach that we asked first in the one question: does your family has a migration background? And if you can indicate it yes, and that is, for example, Turkey, Morocco, or Cape Verdean or something like that. Then later in the questionnaire, we'll ask for everyone who indicated that they have migration background. We basically give them the actual options, right? Again, there's this 5-point scale that I showed you earlier, from how do you see this person, only Dutch, to it's only Moroccan, for example, or both equally. There's this 5-point scale again, and we can ask this then for everyone who indicated that their family has a migration background, and what migration background it is, the actual group of that. And that's also something which we will inform students up front that this is going to happen, so that they can still choose not to disclose it if they don't want to. But this is the we've played around with a lot of different options, but this is the option that we ended up at the moment to measure this perceived potentially dual belonging or national belonging or out-group belonging of your classmates. And that brings me to the end. So this is what I want to show you. So I want just to mention briefly my collaborators, Tom, the postdoc in my project, my 3 PhD students, and then a lot of other people who are thinking along and working along in different papers. Yeah, so I don't know. Thank you for your attention.